What's up, brand builders? Stephen Hurahan here on the Brand Master podcast. And in this episode, I'm chatting with Michael Johnson, author of one of my favorite branding books, Branding in 5.5 Steps. Now, Michael Johnson created the agency Johnson Banks way back in 1992 after learning his trade in brand consultancy, design, and art direction all over the world, from London to Tokyo to Sydney and beyond. Now, Michael is also a lecturer in universities across the UK. He's a regular speaker at the world's leading design and branding conferences, while The Independent selected him as one of the 10 most notable British designers. And in this episode, Michael shares his experience on how Johnson Banks progressed to offering strategy alongside design, the most effective exercises to perform with clients, and how workshop collaboration and branding is a unifying process. So if you want to learn from one of the most notable designers in the UK about how to run a successful strategy and creative agency, then stick around for this episode of the Brand Master podcast. Welcome to the Brand Master podcast, a show specialized in helping branding professionals and entrepreneurs to build brands using strategy, psychology, and creative thinking. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brand Master podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have Mr. Michael Johnson on with us today. Michael is the author of one of my favorite branding books, Branding in 5.5 Steps. Michael, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us on your morning, and it's great to see that you've got your coffee into you.
Yes, it's lovely to be here, and I have just walked across the common to try and wake myself up, but we may need to break for coffee halfway. Yes, thank you.
No problem at all. Now, as I mentioned before, I really love your book, Branding in 5.5 Steps, and there's a few different reasons that I like it. It's so unique. There's nothing else like it out there, and it really does kind of tackle branding from the designer's perspective, but bringing us into the world of strategy and kind of bridging that gap. And I came across that book kind of long after I had started down the road into brand strategy. But reading the book was kind of reassuring for me because it just confirmed so many things that I started to believe were true. And coming from you and somebody with your background and your experience, it was kind of great to see that affirmation. And where I'd kind of like to take this chat with you today is really kind of going back to the early days of when you started your agency. Your agency now has been going for 30 years now at this point. 1992, is that right?
Yeah, we're going to be 30 in the autumn. Yeah.
Nice. So you've been going all of these years, and I really wanted to kind of get a feel from your perspective. The kind of journey into starting your agency way back then in 1992, and kind of how you arrived at that moment to create that agency, and what those early months and that first year was like.
Well, I mean, I think the truth is that I was one of those slightly chippy 20-year-old designers. I think and we all know them and meet them. Yeah, and very, very rarely give them a job because they have trouble written on their forehead. But I was one of those, and I had a series of jobs in my 20s as a graphic designer, principally. I started off at Wolf Owens as a consultant, and then thought, oh no, I got to work out how to use my hands and become a designer. This is a long time ago now. I think in the end of the day, I had a dream that sounds a bit... I think in my head, I thought maybe I could start a company by the time I was 30. As it happened, I turned out to be slightly unemployable by about the age of 28. And then I was sort of slightly lumped into starting a company. I went through that. And at the time, I did have a client who I got on well with, and we started this thing, Banks. I was the Johnson, he was the Banks. And we started something that was kind of doing, if you like, corporate design. And that lasted okay for a couple of years. And then we kind of had, what did they say in the music? We'll have musical differences. And actually, he left quite soon, only after about 3 years. But I kept the name because I liked it, so it made it sound big. And to answer your question properly, I really spent the 90s just trying to do the best graphic design I could. I don't think there was any, I won't pretend that I was trying to change the world or change graphic design. I was just trying to proved that I could run a design company that did decent graphic design. And 90s graphic design in Britain was an interesting point. It was trying to come out of that 70s, 80s idea thing, but like slightly twee, if you like, design world at the time.
Yeah.
And reacting to new companies like the Why Not Associates and Tomato, who were very hip at the time. And that had quite a seismic effect on the business. And that was quite an interesting time to be a graphic designer. But then things changed in chapters 2 and 3, but maybe we'll come on to that.
Yeah, and obviously, the changes that would have gone on from that point, you would have had to kind of really kind of keep up with everything that was going on. How back then was it like getting clients? Because obviously it's a different world now. What was it like back then trying to get clients? And what would you say are still the similarities today of what's relevant to go out and find clients today?
Well, the similarity is that the word of mouth network still works in each sector.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people within education or fundraising or not-for-profit or whatever it may be, talk to each other. And actually, they probably take more credence from their peers and friends within the industry, whichever industry it is, than actually going to Creative Review or It's Nice That or wherever. They don't do that as a natural course. They ask people. So that's still very similar. Back then, making a noise was obviously this is pre-internet. So there were, that was quite challenging actually. Yes, you didn't have that many ways to put yourself on the map. I think there was more emphasis on doing breakthrough graphic design, just because that was the way to get noticed, to get written about, whether it be in a journal or this, that, or the other. Because I know it sounds weird, but we are literally before any website, before anything. So how did you get your name out? Yeah. One of the ways to do it was to do great work that got noticed and maybe won the odd award or two. That's true. I'll admit that. Weirdly, that's changed a lot now. That seems to be much less relevant because, of course, there are all of these channels by which you can get your own work out, and not only other channels, but one's own channels, treating one's Instagram page as a kind of channel. Yeah. So some things are very similar, like word of mouth. Some things are incredibly different, like the channels which you talk to the world.
Yeah. And look, we're obviously so lucky today. Of course, that's a double-edged sword. There's so much great work out there that goes unnoticed because, the people creating that great work, they don't necessarily have the marketing chops to go out and promote that work, whereas somebody else, they know how to do it and they're promoting their work, and that's getting all of this awareness. And I definitely see you as the traditional graphic designer, somebody who has worked in graphic design with their hands. Did you offer? Obviously, you didn't offer strategic services from the beginning. How did that kind of come into your world? How did strategy come into your world, and how did you start offering that to clients? And why did you start offering that to clients?
Well, I think if I'm honest, I think I've always innately been strategic. Actually, one famous designer, John McConnell, an ex-Pentagram partner, said that all the best designers were innately strategic. Anyway, because you kind of worked out where someone was in the market and how to pitch an idea and all those kind of things. So I think I always had a sense of that. My first job at Wolf Ellens was as a consultant. I did a course that combined business and design. But the truth is that it did take us a while to fold what we would now call truly strategic services into what we did. And in fact, throughout by the late 90s, we were attracting bigger projects, and we tended to collaborate with strategic consultancies, people I knew that would do analysis and then would write the kind of core. I don't think we even really called it brand narrative then, but something. There was lots of discussion about straw men, I seem to remember. I worked with a team who always had a straw man that was taken into a meeting. I always hated that phrase, actually. So I don't want to talk about bloody straw men. I want to talk about what the company's about. But anyway, yes. So at first, we were kind of collaborating with other people. And then slowly things started to shift. The main shift, actually, was that our client base in the noughties started to shift towards not-for-profits. I really wanted to do stuff more in the cultural and not-for-profit space.
Yeah.
And they didn't, that type of client then, and probably now, although definitely then, did not have what I would call double fees. They did not have 75 grand, let's say, to spend on a strategic consultant and the same amount or more to spend on a design. They simply didn't have 150, 200 grand. I'm talking pounds, but the numbers are indicative, really.
Yeah.
Similar numbers all over the world, really. I.e., you need a lot of money to have a really good thinker and a really good doer. So we were getting offered these really incredibly interesting projects. Save the Children, I remember, sort of 2004-5 came to us, and so we sort of bit the bullet, and all the things that we'd learned and all the things I'd remembered and all the things I read, we started to test those ideas about how to position an organization, how to write a simple piece of narrative. And that we really started to test that about coming up to about 20 years ago now. Yeah.
That's funny. I actually, when I first came over here to Australia in my 20s as a backpacker, I worked for Save the Children, and I was probably handing out the flyers that you had designed probably about 20 years ago. But
maybe I remembered actually this morning the conundrum why I started doing this actually was because the prompt actually was I had a meeting with the chief executive of Save the Children, who banged her fist on the table telling me how it was so important what they did, A, and B, the other thing that happened was that I kept on going into meetings, and they would say this. They would say, "We're really worried about our name, and people always ask us what we do." And I always thought this was extraordinary. Actually, I think that might have been my light bulb moment thinking about it, because you imagine you've got a name like Save the Children. You couldn't get a better name, really, could you? What do you do? We save the children, and they were saying to me, "Well, people don't know what we do." And then I sort of thought, okay, my job here is very clear. I have to make it clear what this organisation does. And in fact, I end up writing this line: "We save the children. Will you?" And this became this kind of proto line. I just use it in a presentation, and everyone in the room went, "Oh, this is really good. You've activated our name." Actually, they didn't say that. I'm saying that in retrospect, but all of a sudden, I kind of stumbled into positioning of a huge organization and how to activate a name and how to make it clear what they did. So those 3 tick boxes that one would want on pretty much any project were kind of ticked. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I think really that's when, 20 years ago, that's when it all started.
And kind of fast forwarding to today and moving kind of away from not-for-profits, have you seen kind of an increased understanding and an appetite for what strategy is and how important it is? Because back then, clients didn't really have the words to really define what it is that they were looking for. And now it seems brand strategy, is topical. It's and clients seem to understand it more. Is that what you've also found, that there's more of an appetite for strategy? They understand what it is and they're coming to you wanting more?
I think so. Yes. We go back to that time 20 years ago. It was the tumbleweed really, in terms of, you spend most of your first meeting just explaining what you thought a brand was, and no one was clear. In fact, no one is clear now anyway, but that's a separate issue. Now, 20 years later, a lot of the things that one might have been doing 20 years ago have been, quite a lot of those processes have been taken in-house because organizations understand them so well. So, I don't think I've done a SWOT analysis for a decade because that's so often been done in-house. Increasingly, our clients, organizational, educational, philanthropic, whatever, have done where we are. They've done a kind of bit of a market analysis. Quite a lot of them have done some values because that's been taken on board by an HR function. Interesting. A lot of those ideas are moving in-house, which is always a sign that an idea is being understood. And so we're not having to go, I don't think, it's been a while since I've used 10 slides explaining what a brand is. Yes. Whereas I used to have to use those all the time 10, 15 years ago. And now it's quite rare because I can pretty much get into it and we will say, well, there's a problem and this is how we're going to do it. So Yes, in answer to your question, I do think that has changed. I mean, I suppose you have to temper that with the fact that you and I have been doing this a while, and it seems more obvious, and we are looking, aren't we? We're looking for evidence that brand is everywhere. It does feel like, yeah, the battle has been won, and brand is anywhere. You could paradoxically say that perhaps we're now at the other end of that, where you're starting to get these battles about, what's the purpose of purpose, and why are all these blue chip organizations pretending that they're changing the world where they're not? So you're possibly even seeing a little bit of a backlash against some of that. But anyway.
Yeah, at the top end, I think you're 100% right, because we've got all these debates going on about the purpose of purpose and the whole vision and mission, and how irrelevant they are in this day and age, and they're kind of old hat. But at the same time, I think as you come down the ladder a little bit to the medium to smaller size companies, I think it's only now that these guys are catching up. And in some cases, you still have to enlighten them or kind of show them that there are more than just visual problems to solve. And this is a quote from your book: "Creatives end up creating fantastic solutions for the wrong problems." What are some of the ways that we can kind of open up that discussion of bigger problems to clients if they are just focused on those visual problems?
Well, okay, I think in my case, 85-90% of my clients are not coming to us because they don't sit in a meeting and say, we need a new logo. And we very, very rarely have that conversation. 90% of the meetings are about, the initial meetings are about, something's wrong here. We're in the wrong place. We're not understanding our market. People seem to have a misperception of us, or So the vast amount of time people are coming to us with what we would call a strategic problem, and we will then endeavor to spend some time, it could be weeks, it's often months, trying to understand what that strategic problem. So to your question, we can work out what the real problem is and start the design phase, which is our third phase, in the right place, because there's nothing worse than, and of course I still do it as boil me down to glue, and I'm still a graphic designer. I'll still sit there in meeting 2 and think, oh, I've got it, and I'm scribbling it in my notepad, and that might cloud my judgment. But I've got to kind of park that design part of my head for a bit until I've worked out quite where they should be. Because it is a complete waste of time if you just end up doing, I don't know, some slam dunk, amazing kind of whoosh bang graphic design whiz bang idea for a client who just doesn't need that or want that. Of course, there are some clients who want that. So I started thinking harder about this, really, because I spent my 20s designing what I thought were great ideas, but because I had no contact with the client, really, I was just buried in organizations. I just had no perception of what they really needed. And so I guess that's really underlying everything that I've been talking about for 25 years, really, which is you've got to understand where someone is in a market. Before you can take them forward, because otherwise you just might try and take them too far, and that's just a waste of time, really. You need to understand their frame of reference and then just push them slightly out of it rather than push them over the edge.
And I suppose that ties in then to how important you see the brand audit, which is something that you speak about in your book. You talk about the visual, the verbal, the behavioral, the competitor audit. How do you find that information? How do you collate it and then present that information? Is it based on positive findings and negative findings? Is it based on insights? How do you go about that? What's your process like?
Well, it's a bit of a mixture, actually. We do a lot of we still do a lot of interviews, still a lot of one-to-ones, talking to people about what the problem is, get them out of the boardroom. Well, I'm back on Zoom at the moment, but of course, but originally we did that face-to-face, so that there weren't a group of people all telling them what they should think. What do they really think? Lots of visual audits of what they are doing, what they are saying, what their competitors are doing and saying. And once we've got all that information, we're starting to, the interviews are of course really helpful because we get a sense of what the real problem is. And the answer is within an organization. I don't really believe that someone like me just comes wheeling in and with the magic bullet, silver bullet, if you will. I think normally there is an answer within an organization, but the interviews are a bit like a bell curve in that you quickly find out what really is going on. The visual audits, I kind of flip flop about that, but actually I've discovered that to your question, it is just showing people what everyone else is doing. It isn't actually that useful, but filleting those 70 slides down to 7 key slides. These are the insights that we can tell you from your market, and look what everyone else is doing. I think one of the key things that we find is that tendency of a market to be like sheep, to follow each other down, whether it be, I don't know, finding replacements for leather. We're doing a project at the moment, which is like organic leather replacements, or positioning universities, or how cultural organizations talk about themselves. 3 very different markets, but it's always amazing to me how they all share the same language. And so those kind of audits are fantastically useful for me, because then I can say to a boardroom, just 6-8 weeks in, look, this is what everyone else is saying. Do you want to be the same as them? And that can be a very direct question. I mean, sometimes they say yes, and we sort of gently extricate ourselves from the process. Because, I mean, what's the point of being being the same as everyone else, But 9 times out of 10, they say, no, gosh, no. Yeah, we know, oh, gosh, we get it. And they start to then understand the positioning process or the differentiation process, or whatever word you want to use. I see. We might draw some maps, and we sort of say, well, look, this is where they are. What, do you want to be there? Or do you want to put yourself in a slightly different place? And then bit by bit, especially if they're not trained marketeers, they start to say, oh, I get it now. We need to be in 2 places at once. How are we going to do that? All those things that
And you said that your initial phase, it could go on for weeks or even months. And obviously, a lot of what goes on in this process are, exercises. And there's a section in your book, simple exercises, big outcomes. What do you feel are the most effective exercises to perform with the client? And then what kind of exercises do you perform without the client?
I think it depends a bit on the project. I think the truth is that what we are trying to do usually is we're trying to get through our insight stage pretty fast. It's not always possible. Some clients, we might need to do 40 interviews. I think the most useful bit of work that we do with our clients is in our second stage, where we have come to them with a sort of some roughed out slides about, what it is that we think that they do, what we think their market is. And then they really get into that. And there's lots of shouting and writing on paper, or writing in Google Docs now. And then the absolute key to our process, at least, is when we get to the bit, well, so why are you here? What's your core? What's the core idea at the core of you? And at that stage, we will not just go to them with one. We will nearly always posit at least 3 ways of doing that. And that is the most powerful part of this process, I think, because eventually, whether they like it or not, even the biggest naysayer on any client side ever is presented with 3 slides, and within 80 words, a headline in 80 words, they're thinking, and then you could almost literally see the penny drop, and they go, oh, crikey, I see what you mean. So if we do that, that makes us seem like this. If we do that, it makes us seem like this. And if we talk like that, then, and all of a sudden, all the principles of strategy, brand identity, brand narrative, positioning, differentiation, all of those things are kind of distilled down into 3 slides. And pennies drop simultaneously.
And
that, I think, if one was being really reductionist to your question, that is the absolute key to the process. And I found the key to the process, if I want my clients to really engage in this, is not to tell them who they are, is to say, we think you could be one of these. And then I've found that to be incredibly reciprocal, because then you start to tease out who they really want to be, who they really are.
And you're dead right. The language that you use is so important in terms of guiding your client in the right way. If you tell them what they need to be, you're going to get a lot of pushback. Whereas if you kind of invite them in, if you guide them in, and if you kind of position it in a way that it's nearly their idea and their decision, then they're going to be invested in it. And you speak about this in your book as well. You touch on disenfranchised key directors who feel that they're not consulted. And
Yes.
This is obviously a common problem. We've all heard the stories or had the experiences of clients coming back with change after change after change, and that's where I feel this all comes from. They feel that they haven't been consulted. They feel that they're not involved in the process. How do you make sure that you avoid that and make sure that they feel like they've been part of the whole thing?
The lone wolf on the boardroom, or on the Zoom call now, often with their camera off. It's like, there's a kind of real passag tactic, that is. It is difficult, and in some cases. Okay, so when we did a big project, and are still doing a big project for Cambridge University that has become quite famous, which was about repositioning, an 800-year-old institution effectively, and they had tried to write some narrative. It was, like what I call kitchen sink narrative, had everything in it. And then so we rebooted the process, and we said to them, look, I think that it might be smart for us to talk to quite a lot of people, because further down the line, I think we knew what was coming, that sure enough, 3 months down the line, we were in some very, very sticky meetings with some very, very powerful and very clever people. And I am convinced that we would not have got the idea of writing a letter to the world, summarized as Dear World, Yours Cambridge. We would have not got that through had we not met most of the people in that room beforehand and heard what they had to say. Now, we don't necessarily always take what they say at face value, or even write it down, or even use it, but their voice was heard. So when 3 months later they had me stand up in a boardroom and say, okay, here's the idea, we're going to write a letter to the world, they were thinking, half of them was thinking, this guy's an idiot, call security, but the other half was thinking, well, hang on a second, I met him and he did talk sense, and maybe he's got a point. And so that is the benefit of that. Sometimes there is someone, and they're going to be a problem. So it's more like boardroom tactics, really. You're just trying to outflank them. I had one the other day, actually. I was warned that there was going to be a camera off pass ag problem. And interestingly, I kind of... said person shot themselves in the foot, because they went around the room in a Zoom perspective to ask everyone's view. And everyone was really into this idea. And by the time we got to the PASAG camera off, this person said, oh, well, I seem to be in a minority of one. And you could hear, the foundations that this person had built for themselves crumbling on the Zoom call. And so that's a tactic. I'll admit, I have sometimes gone into attack mode. I was warned about another one. This is a while ago now. And I think I used the phrase, something like the word, look, we've shown this to your board. We've shown this to the people. We've had focus groups. 34 people are on board here, and you're the single voice against. So I have used that, but that is a doomsday trick. Yeah, because you're basically saying, they're all right, you're wrong. What are you going to do? Are you going to be the sole voice? So
it's not often a recommended strategy to go head to head with the client, especially because every personality is different as well. And if you're going to get somebody who's confrontation in the first place, then chances are you're not going to win that battle. But
there's an underlying thing here, though, which is what we're really talking about is designers in a boardroom. And strategic consultants generally have got the gab, and they can talk the talk and can handle the back and forwards of the boardroom, of the kind of, oh, what does he mean? What does she mean? Oh, have I fucked this up? Oh my God, what am I going to do? After a bit of time, a strategic consultant can handle that. But generally speaking, as a rule, designers are not trained to handle that. So really, I've been from pretty much the word go, we try very, very hard to get ourselves into the boardroom as early as we can. I think that's one of the mistakes we were making in our first decade, that we were doing great design that was being shown to someone, but it never got up, or when it got up, it got filtered, or do you know what I mean? So we started to realize after about a decade that we had to, I'm afraid we had to kind of go above some, and I have done it. We had to go above the comms function, the marketing function, and meet the chief executive, meet the chairman, meet the CEO, whoever it is now. Because without that, if you're trying to do huge strategic brand changes like we do, you are in serious trouble when you get to that denouement moment, when you get to that moment that I described for Cambridge, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, you describe brand strategy as a unifying process, you know, where you bring everybody together, and you know, sometimes the leadership team might come together, but they might come together on a direction that you don't feel is the right direction. Have you come across that before? And how do you handle that, if you have?
Well, most of the time, the process that we've been talking about pulls everyone down an agreed route. And we carefully navigate that route for them, yes. And we wouldn't put a brand scenario in front of someone that we didn't think was going to work, or wouldn't differentiate them, or wouldn't be differentiating. Yeah. So by definition, what some design companies do, that safe route, good route, scary route thing. We would never do that with narrative. There's no point, you know. What's the point of writing some safe narrative? You know, that's a complete waste of time. Anyway, slight distraction. So what sometimes what happens more often, to your question, is a client side, they might be, before we've really started the process, usually they might be enamored with an idea, or they might be enamored with a direction.
And I suppose that's where it's coming from, because that is more common.
Yeah, and I think that is quite scary. And sometimes we've been pulled down these areas, and then we've got a long way into the process, and we've realized, actually, this is really not working. Even though various parrots and alarm were talking to us on our shoulders and alarm bells were going, we might have been pulled that way. We did a very big global NGO a few years ago that they're federally structured, and they're global. So, but one of the countries is more powerful than the others, even though they're federal. Anyway, word that one out if you can. And they kind of pulled the process down a wholesale rebrand. And then we were into our design stage, and then voices off started to say, well, actually, we think there's still something in the visual identity that we have at the moment. We don't think it's right, and we agree with all your analysis, Michael, that it's not really functioning very well. But we think there's a recognizability in this. So sometimes it takes a while to get to that point, that realization that, oh, okay, we've got to reset here, and that takes quite a lot of guts on both client side and our side to sort of say, okay, we've got this wrong. And we have reset a few times. It doesn't happen that often, maybe once every 2 years we sort of have to reset the process. We've just been doing a mental health organization, and we had to do a reset on that, because actually we and the client got slightly too drawn into this B2C kind of end consumer of their mental health services. And actually we kind of slightly forgotten about their their academic B2B side. And as we got further down the road, and they did focus groups with schools and teachers and what have you, i.e. went more and more B2C, they sort of put the ideas into an echo chamber that just made them feel like they should be further and further down there. Eventually we realized, no, we've just gone too far that way. So it's not a very astute answer to your question. I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, it still happens to me. And sometimes we're quite a long way down the process, and you just have to be prepared to reset, prepared to say, okay, this is not quite right. Ideally, if, which I think is the original question, if a client is going in the wrong direction, then it is the role and responsibility of the consultant to say, no, you've got this completely wrong. Now, you might have to have some serious evidence. You might have to have some killer facts. You might have to have done some very key focus groups with some staff.
And
the
even
staff,
if you present that, even if you present that, and they still want to go down that road, is that a deal breaker for you? Do you step away? Yeah.
I mean, we've just got sent a piece of narrative by a major educational institution, and it almost reads like a thesaurus of fundraising language. 8 pages long, 9-point word file. I'd say there was about 8,000 words in there.
Wow.
And, we've got to say to them, look, if you're holding to this, we're out.
Yeah.
Because they've put their position, and I don't know how I can differentiate them. But then maybe that's easy for me to say because I'm old and grey and got grey flecks in my beard and all that kind of shit. But I think that if one can see that this is going in the wrong direction and you can't persuade them otherwise, then we would just get out.
Yeah, look, I mean, you hope to iron all of that out in the early stages, and one of the a tool that freelancers and other agencies are using for that early work would be the brand strategy workshop. And is that something, or do you have an equivalent of a brand strategy workshop, and how do you kind of structure that?
I mean, I think that the level of client that we're talking about, they don't need a workshop to nut out their brand strategy in a day, because they know where they're going. If you're talking about a major London museum, they've already got a lot of information to hand. And the key bit of our process would be that narrative, the brand narrative workshop. That's probably the most important workshop, because, scrambling and sprinting through this, that, and the other, and, spending a day trying to work out whether your values are innovative or impetus, or, are you about evolution or energy? Life's a little bit too short for me. I think I've learned now that focusing our energies on why you're here, what's the big idea, that's the key workshop for me. Yes, it is a workshop, but it's not an all-day thing where we will discover our lives. And actually, I think it's slightly arrogant, if you like, of a consultant to sort of say, in this day we will establish everything that you need to know. I mean, oh, come on, really? Really, is this organization incapable of having any plans about who it wants to be? So what we do is we break it down into a series of presentations, a series of, some of them are workshops, some of them are really just meetings of discussions. And apologies, I know, because there's a big world out there making a lot of cash out of brand strategy workshops. I mean, I just don't bill it.
I think really, with the top tier businesses and brands that you're working with, they have their strategic departments, they have their marketing departments. I think often, yes. where brand strategy workshops come in, and probably the audience that listen to this podcast have smaller agencies, they might be freelancers, and they're dealing with smaller businesses who are good at what they do. They're good at making this or providing this service, and they don't really have time to think about brand or strategy. And I think that's where the brand strategy workshop comes in, because it brings these ideas and these concepts to them, and in many times it's for the very first time, and it's kind of an educational process as well. So I think up where you're playing is a different ball game, and but it's great to kind of have these insights into what it's like up there, and I think talking about pricing then will give us an insight as to how it happens up there versus how it happens down here. There's a lot of talk of value-based pricing in our world, and for some clients it's too small. They don't get it. They don't know what value they're going to get from the work that you do for them. Is value-based pricing something that you use? Is it something that you've come across, and is it something that you use to price your work?
I think I have to say, I think all bets are off on pricing at the moment. I mean, the way that we have been traditionally worked is that we have started somewhere. We have I guess the traditional way, which is work out how long this is going to take and attach hours
Yes.
to it. And mainly, we've been doing it that way probably because we often have other people within the mix who aren't in-house, they're out-house. Maybe it's copywriters and consultants, and and that seems to be a manageable way to get towards a figure, which we can then discuss with the client. It does then get a bit, what's the word? Attritional as you're into this stage where, well, you're too usually the reply is, well, you're too expensive. And then you're into this weird kind of push me, pull you about, well, what are you messing about with the daily rates, or are you just basically doing less work? And that's an interesting one. Well, however, more recently, we have been doing a series of projects with startups. We've been trying to kind of up our startup game. And that's an interesting world where we essentially, they cannot afford what the paper fees are, essentially, in essence. And so then you're into an interesting new world, which is, okay, so how are we going to do this? So we're experimenting with different models at the moment. One model is where we've done a relatively low cash fee, but we've taken shares. Another model is, quite an interesting model, is that we said, okay, they're clearly going to go through funding rounds, and we said that we'll bill you 50% of the project as we do it, and then we'll bill another 30 at the next round, and another 30 at the final round. So you will end up paying 120%, but it will be over a length of time, and that's quite a smart model, I think, actually.
Absolutely.
And that really appeals to people, because then we know. I mean, we've obviously taken a gamble there. But we haven't taken a massive gamble. We've taken a gamble on 50% of the fees rather than 90% of the fees, which is probably more like the shares model. Toying also with the idea of a royalty model, I must admit, just because some of the things that we do, realize so much cash for people that you'd only be human if you didn't sort of say, well, okay, wow. One of Cambridge, we've raised £2 billion for them.
Wow.
5 years. Dear world, yours Cambridge. 4 words, a comma and an ellipsis. 2 billion. And you did, one of the parrots on one of the shoulders sort of said, Michael, are you sure? They paid for the project. The project was paid for itself on the launch night because someone gave them a donation of 5 million. Don't worry, we didn't charge 5 million, but everything, all of the event and all of them, all of the catering, quite a big deal. But it was paid for itself on the launch night. It's like, oh my goodness, So we are amending our model. I think it's fair to say. And the truth is, it's a tricky one, because if you say to someone who haven't got any cash, look, you're going to turn yourself into a major brand here, so you are going to pay us, 250 grand for this. Then to a startup, they just sort of look at you like you're a complete lunatic, but it is a tricky one. It's quite challenging to work out a way through this.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, though, our problem is we're always too expensive.
Well, that's a great problem to have, isn't it?
Well, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. We're always getting into these bizarre. I mean, the difficulty we have, of course, is that we have a not-for-profit, for good client base, and we don't do that thing that other people do, was that they'll do a bank or a luxury brand where they're charging 100% fees, and then you're doing a charity at pro bono or at 50% fees, and then everything levels it out. Our moral compass is set. It doesn't swing about like other people's do, and we all know who they are, the people who are swinging backwards and forwards from a luxury car to a museum, and you sort of think, how can you do that? You're basically you don't care who you're working for anyway. So we're set on our course, but it does mean that, if say, I think most companies, 60-70% of their turnover is fixed costs, But the gap between our turnover and our fixed cost it gets very close. The margin is not a lot. We do not come out of a year with, I lease a new car every 4 years. I don't buy a new Porsche every year. Let's put it that way. The margin is not high, but that is the course we have chosen. So
So if now obviously you've been doing this now for 30 years with the same agency, but if you had to go back, okay, let's say, and or, if I was to strip you of your title, of your name, of your notoriety, of everything that you've done, of your awards, and you had to kind of go back and start at the beginning in this new world that we are in today, what would be the first few things that you would do to kind of land yourself on the map, and then to kind of push that out to some kind of agency growth?
Well, that's a good question. I think that one thing still stands and has always stood, which is that any new company has got, well, I'm not sure on the timings anymore, let's say between 2 and 4 years to do something that sets them apart. If you don't do that, if you're listening to this as a designer or a branding startup, if you don't do something within the next 2 or 4 years that makes it clear that you offer something different to other people, then that's a problem, because then you just end up being a cheaper version of who you used to work for. Yeah. So you have to. Startups, as I learned this very fast in the 90s, startups have to differentiate themselves. Otherwise, you're in trouble. I nearly said a rude word there, but I didn't. And so in our case, we did a project in the mid-90s for the V&A for an exhibition on William Morris. And I think we just did it in a different way, beat a lot of name companies to get it. And we did it in a different way. And people in London at the time, I think, looked at that and thought, oh, that's different. And that was kind of the start, if you like. What else would I do? I think I would examine the funding model if I did this again, because what we just talked about is challenging and regularly challenging, especially with my kind of client base. I met a guy a few years ago. I haven't seen him for a while. He was a very lovely guy who runs an architecture practice in the States called Mass, and they do all these amazing projects like creating and building schools in Rwanda and this, that, and the other. Beautifully designed, but also for good. And I said to him, how do you do this? And he said, well, we run a philanthropic model. So what they do is they approach philanthropists in the States who will basically fund their ability to do these amazing architecture projects where they are most needed. And part of me has always wondered about that model. Now, I'm probably a little too far down the line of what I am at the moment, but if I were to reboot, might consider that. I'm not saying that's the model, but you know what I mean? You examine the funding model in some way. And I think because of my world, you're doing all of these things for good and you're just trying to stay in business. But if you sort of if I approach people and I say, look, I could do more for good if you supported this, it'd be an interesting, no one's ever done that in branding. I think that would be really interesting.
Absolutely.
What else would we, I think I'd probably have to take a long, hard look at the agency model, full stop, actually, because I don't think we're unusual in pursuing this kind of hub and spoke model where you've got a small core and then you're spoking out to other people. And I think the pandemic has just accelerated that.
Yeah.
The principle of having 35 people in a room all working on projects X, Y, and Z is starting to feel a bit antique.
It's a conversation that's been going on for quite a while, actually.
Yes, yeah, and gathering around you a core team, and then not relying, but bringing in the experts. You don't. We work with 3 or 4 filmmakers. I don't want a filmmaker in house. We work with 6 or 7 animators, all animate in different ways. Do I need that animator in house? So I think I'd be examining the model, examining the funding, but the thing that doesn't go away is the need to stand out. The need to differentiate yourself, the need to brand yourself as well as branding others, I guess, in essence.
Yeah. And I think, certainly, without this idea of radical differentiation, and I know Marty Neumeyer talks about radical differentiation, and it's so hard to be radically different to everything else. Sometimes, what you do is just a little bit different or slightly different, but just any kind of angle, any kind of hook that gives you a little bit more relevance and, something interesting to talk about, and to give your audience a reason at the end of the day is what they need. Because
I think we kind of stumbled on our differentiator in a way, in that I've always loved words. I've used words in the work I did even before I started my company. I would get much more out of looking at art directors and advertising. Not that I want to be an advertiser, but I always loved that interaction between word and picture. And I just kept doing that. And my example that I gave you earlier on, "We save the children, will you?"
Yes.
That is a line.
Yeah.
It's not a piece of graphic design, but this idea of seeing the words and pictures as all part of the communication. It's not as radical as it was, but for a while there, we were the only people doing it.
Yeah,
and people would come to us and say, "Oh, you're the people who are using words," and to me, this was like astonishingly weird. Well, why wouldn't you? They're so useful. But for a long, long, long time, and still, graphic designers, tend to be the more dyslexic kids in the class or what have you, and the words are the grey bits between the pictures. Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Michael. Now let's do some pictures. And we talk about light bulb moments for branding. Clearly, something that's had a massive change, certainly here, and I sense down there or up there, depending on which way you look at it, has been the whole role of messaging and tone of voice.
Yes,
and how our brand speaks. Now that if you think about it, we were doing this 20 years ago, and so we get people talking to us about, well, will you be helping us with our message and our tone of voice? We're going, yes, of course we will. Duh. But and this is something that we're just at the beginning of that, I think. And it's like the world has suddenly cottoned on to the idea that your words are as important as your pictures. And it's like, I feel like I've been banging my head against the wall for 20 years, maybe 30. Actually. But it's fine because the world has come to me. But maybe coming back to differentiators, maybe now I'm in trouble because I can't say that. That's what makes us different anymore.
No, but I mean, you've been doing it for so long and so well that it's the benchmark. And you're right. I mean, it's becoming so much more. People are becoming so much more aware of the importance of their words, and not only the words that they use, but the personality and tone in which they use them. Because at the end of the day, we're just connecting with other humans, and if you're able to hit the right note with those people, then you make that connection. And at the end of the day, that's the game.
Yeah, and I think that what's exacerbated this, of course, been social media, in that it's done some terrible things to brand, but it's done some good things, and this need to communicate, to find a voice has really come out through social media, and I think that's a good thing. Yeah, but of course it means that you then have to do 150 iterations of your messaging rather than 4. So it's kind of it's hard. And we had one client approach us, and they said we can't do this like a normal project because we have 14 different target markets. And then within 4 months, they'd raised it to 18, and we're sort of saying, oh my goodness, So the messaging matrix for that project was like, brain buster that was. We did it, but you can do it.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
It's been a really great chat, Michael, to kind of get an insight into your world and kind of what goes on up there, and really coming from a traditional graphic design background as well, because I think a lot of our listeners, that's how they got into the branding game, and their love is for graphic design. So to kind of hear all of these concepts and ideas tying in together to give us the meaning of what we do and the understanding of branding, it's been great. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. If anybody hasn't read the book, Branding in 5.5 Steps, go out and do yourself a favor, get that book. Michael, where can people find out about you if they want to follow you, learn more about you? Where can they do that?
Well, the best place to start is our website, johnsonbanks.co.uk. Our Instagram feed is getting a little better. And there are a couple of other books as well. My first book, Problem Solved, is more about problem solving in general. More recently, I read a little green book called Now Try Something Weirder, which is about creativity. The branding book, yes, is this one. He says, reaching for it. This one does. Look, yellow stickies in my own book.
You remember
well, no,
what
that's
you
true,
said.
actually. I regularly refer to my own book, which I find is a very weird and very meta moment. But it's because I think, well, no, hang on a sec, how do I do that? And every time that happens, it's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever dropped a vase and your first reaction is to go Apple Z. You know that moment where, this has happened to me twice in my life, and I wanted to undo reality. And so when I reach for my book,
or you say something to your other half that you wish you hadn't, you go Apple Z, Apple Z.
Yeah, that's an Apple Z moment. And when I look in my own book for what I said, I thought, like, oh, that's weird. I actually, in the foothills of a second edition of this, which will be useful. This has proved. I suspected this would be useful.
Yeah,
because no one had
really
written it
is.
all in one book. Yeah.
It's at home sitting on my shelf. I'm actually not in my my home studio today, which is why I don't have it sitting in front of me. But mine doesn't have sticky notes, but it's got half an illustrator just all over the place. So it's but yeah, look, as I said, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been great to chat to you. I hope at some stage I get the opportunity to chat to you again. If you've got any other things coming out in the future, I'd love to have you on to talk to you about it. And it's been super valuable, and I know that everybody who's been listening to this will take a lot from it. So thank you very much. And you've earned your second coffee. So.
Yes, I'm desperate for my second coffee. Yes.
So I'll let you go and get to that.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers, Michael.
All right. Thank you.
If you want to learn more about Michael Johnson's processes, then make sure you check out his course on Domestica Contemporary Brand Identity using verbal and visual branding. It's a well-received course with over 6,000 students and over 270 positive reviews. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to learn more brand strategy techniques to level up your skills, make sure you check out brandmasteracademy.com. There's plenty of free resources and premium content for you to download and get you going. If you'd like to join our Facebook group full of like-minded brand strategists, all learning from each other, then find us by searching for the Brand Strategy Community, where you can find exclusive content for members as well. If you enjoyed this content, please be sure to give us an honest review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listened, and make sure you tune in for the next episode of the Brandmaster Podcast.